Greg's voice cut through the quiet Sunday morning like a siren. "You either pay this fine, or we'll escalate it," he barked, waving a white paper in my face as if it were a badge of authority. I was still standing on my porch in my robe, coffee in hand, heart pounding from the shock. My first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. What fine? What did I do wrong? I stepped off the porch, squinting as the sunlight hit the glare of the document in his hand. "What is this about, Greg?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was racing. He smirked. "Violation of Community Maintenance Standards. Section 12, Sub-Rule 3. Sidewalk deterioration. You're responsible for repair. $1,000. He said it like a police officer reading an arrest warrant, while two of my neighbors, the Martins, pretended to water their flowers nearby, their heads tilted just enough to catch every word. Greg loved an audience. He thrived on control, on humiliation disguised as community order. I took the paper from him, my name printed at the top. Fine amount, $1,000. Offense, cracked sidewalk adjacent to Lot 18. That's my house, sure. But that sidewalk? It ran along the street corner, a stretch of concrete I never even set foot on. I looked up from the letter. "Greg, that sidewalk isn't even mine." He crossed his arms, a smug smile creeping across his face. "Everything within the community boundary is subject to HOA maintenance standards. You signed the agreement when you bought in, Emily. If you didn't read it, that's not my problem." I could feel my cheeks burn. "Then show me where it says I'm responsible for something that doesn't belong to me." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Don't start something you can't finish." Then, with deliberate precision, he turned, handed me the letter, and walked away. The kind of walk meant to humiliate you in your own yard. I stood there for a few seconds, the paper trembling in my hand. I could feel the neighbors' eyes burning into my back, their sympathy quiet, their fear louder. No one ever challenged Greg, not because he was right, but because he was ruthless. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with that notice spread out under the glow of the lamp. The words "failure to pay may result in lien action" stared back at me like a threat. I wasn't wealthy, I had just bought this house, my first real investment after years of renting. The idea of some petty man with a clipboard jeopardizing that. It made my stomach twist. I pulled out the manila folder I kept from closing day. The deed, survey, plat maps. The smell of paper and ink brought me right back to that signing table where I thought I'd left the stress of paperwork behind. I started tracing the lines on the map with my finger, reading the measurements carefully. My property stopped exactly 2 feet before that sidewalk. Beyond that, public right-of-way, county maintained, not HOA, not me. I leaned back in my chair, realization dawning in waves. Either Greg hadn't done his homework, or he was betting I wouldn't do mine. Outside my window, the night was still, except for the faint sound of Greg's motion light flicking on across the street. I looked down again at the boundary line, the ink slightly faded but clear enough to see, and that's when I noticed it. A small marking on the map, right over the edge of Greg's own parcel, labeled Common Easement, HOA Maintenance Zone. My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't fined me for my sidewalk. He'd fined me for his. I stared at the map under the lamp's flickering light, realizing Greg had just made a $1,000 mistake, and I was going to make sure he regretted it. My voice sliced through the still air of the county recorder's office. "Wait, this says the sidewalk belongs to the HOA president's parcel, not mine." Every head in that quiet little room turned toward me. The clerk behind the counter blinked, then adjusted his glasses and leaned forward as if he hadn't quite heard me right. Mr. Hughes was his name, an older man with kind eyes and decades of patience carved into the wrinkles of his face. He looked from the document to me and gave a slow nod. "Let's take a closer look, ma'am," he said, motioning for me to follow him toward a back counter where the county's property maps were kept. The smell of old paper, toner, and dust hung in the air, the kind of place where truth hides quietly in filing cabinets until someone determined enough comes to dig it out. He pulled up my parcel number on his computer, and within seconds, the county's digital map appeared on the screen. Color-coded blocks, black boundary lines, labeled easements. My address sat right there. Lot 18. He zoomed in, tracing the borders with a shaky finger. "You see this?" he said. "Your property line ends right here, 2 feet before the sidewalk." My eyes narrowed as I followed his finger. "And this?" I asked, pointing to the strip of concrete between my boundary and the curb. He smiled knowingly. "That's part of the HOA's common maintenance zone. Technically, it falls under the president's jurisdiction for community repairs. But according to this file," he clicked through another document, "that strip is registered to Parcel 19, which belongs to—" He squinted at the monitor. "To Gregory Wilson." I froze. Greg's name glared from the screen like a confession in ink. For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. All the embarrassment, the anger, the public shaming, it came rushing back. Greg had fined me for something that was literally sitting on his property. "Would you like a certified copy?" Mr. Hughes asked softly. "Yes," I said, my voice sharp, controlled, almost trembling. "And please include the boundary coordinates and the maintenance easement designation." He nodded and walked toward the printer. The sound of the machine spitting out paper felt like justice being born. I could almost hear the gears turning in my head. Greg's smug smirk, his voice echoing across the street, his condescending, "You signed the agreement." Oh, I had signed it all right, but so had he, and that signature was about to become his biggest mistake. As I gathered the documents, I noticed something else in the record. Similar maintenance easements linked to several other homeowners' addresses. If Greg had been fining me for his own property, he might have done the same to others. "Mr. Hughes," I said carefully, "can you check if there are other parcels where the HOA president is listed as maintenance authority, but residents are being fined?" He frowned, typed something into the system, then raised his eyebrows. "Looks like more than one. You might not be the only one getting billed for the wrong sidewalk." My pulse quickened. "Can I get copies of those as well?" He hesitated. "Technically, I can only provide copies for your parcel unless you file an information request." "I'll file it," I said instantly. "Every single page." He handed me the papers, each stamped with the county seal. The embossed mark gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a medal of proof. I folded them carefully, slid them into my bag, and thanked him. Legal nugget: always verify property boundaries with the county's GIS and deed office, not your HOA's internal maps. County records are the only documents that truly define ownership. As I stepped out of the office, the afternoon sun hit my face like a challenge. The wind rustled through the courthouse flag, snapping it sharply, a sound that felt like defiance. I looked down at the manila envelope in my hands, heavy with truth. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was about fraud. Greg had used the HOA as his weapon for years, but now I finally had the ammunition to fight back. My hand slammed the folded deed onto the HOA conference table so hard the sound echoed off the beige walls. "Go ahead, Greg. Read the parcel number out loud," I said, loud enough for everyone in that cramped community hall to hear. The chatter in the room stopped instantly. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. Greg froze mid-sentence, his gavel hovering above the table. Around us, nearly 20 homeowners sat in the folding chairs lined up in neat rows, their HOA packets resting on their laps. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, humming with that cheap, electric buzz that made everything feel tenser. I could feel every eye on me, some supportive, some nervous, some downright afraid. He finally spoke, his voice taut. "This meeting is not the place for—" "Oh, it's exactly the place," I cut in, sliding the certified parcel map across the table toward him. The crisp paper made a satisfying sound as it slid across the laminate surface. "Because the fine you issued me isn't just unfair, it's illegal." A few heads in the crowd tilted forward, curious now. One man whispered to his wife, "Illegal?" Greg's jaw tightened. "You're misinformed, Emily. You clearly don't understand how HOA boundaries work." I leaned forward, planting my hands on the table. "I understand them better than you think. I went to the county recorder's office. I have the certified property lines and easement records. And according to your own subdivision plat, that sidewalk you find me for. It's on your parcel, Greg. Parcel 19. The silence broke into small gasps and murmurs. A few neighbors started flipping through their HOA booklets, others whispering things like, "Wait, what did she just say?" Greg's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "You are out of line," he snapped, his voice cracking just slightly. "You're disrupting official business." "I'm correcting it," I said evenly. "And I'm doing it in front of witnesses, so no one can twist the truth later." I turned to the crowd, my heartbeat loud in my ears but my voice steady. "If any of you have been fined for sidewalk repairs, tree roots, or landscaping near the curb, check your property deeds. Don't just take his word for it. The county office confirmed the HOA's maps are outdated. Some of us are paying for areas we don't even own." The murmuring grew louder now, anger replacing curiosity. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "Greg fined us for the tree roots last year," she whispered to her husband. Greg banged his gavel hard. "That's enough." Meeting adjourned, but no one moved. He grabbed the papers I'd placed in front of him and scanned the parcel numbers, his lips moving silently as he read. When his eyes reached the highlighted section, I saw the realization hit him. He dropped the page back onto the table like it burned. "These documents are being taken out of context," he hissed. "You'll be hearing from the board's counsel." "Good," I said quietly. "So will the county." That did it. He slammed his binder shut, muttered something under his breath I couldn't catch, and stormed out of the hall. The door swung closed behind him with a hollow thud. For a few seconds no one spoke. Then someone in the back whispered, "She's right." Another voice followed, "We need to check our fines." I gathered my papers calmly, heart still racing, but the fear I'd carried since that first fine notice was gone. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting, I was fighting back. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt the eyes of my neighbors on me. Some nodded, others avoided my gaze. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out, and Greg knew it. The next morning, when I opened my mailbox, there was no fine, just a single folded note. 4 words written in thick black ink: "Stop digging, or else." I stepped outside to find another violation notice flapping against my front door in the morning wind. Third one this week. I ripped it off the frame and stormed across my lawn. "Greg!" I yelled toward his porch. "You're pushing the wrong woman." No answer, of course. He never answered when it wasn't on his terms. But I didn't need to hear his smug voice to know he was listening. His blind shifted, just slightly, like a snake watching from the grass. The new notice was absurd. Violation. Trash receptacles visible before 9 a.m. The bins were empty. Pickup had been yesterday. The week before it was unauthorized garden decor, because I'd placed a single bird bath near the front walk. Before that, non-compliant paint tone variation. Apparently, my off-white shutters were too bright. It wasn't enforcement, it was harassment. Plain and simple. By Wednesday, I had a stack of letters thick enough to fill a binder. Every single one had Greg's signature at the bottom, written with that same arrogant flourish, as if he enjoyed putting his name on the chaos he caused. He wasn't just abusing power, he was daring me to break. So I did what he didn't expect. I started documenting everything. My cameras, both doorbell and backyard, became my silent witnesses. I spent the weekend rewinding footage, timestamp by timestamp, until I found what I was looking for. At 10:47 p.m., 2 nights earlier, a figure in a blue hoodie crept along the side of my property. He crouched, flashlight in hand, snapping photos of my garden, my porch, even my living room window. When he turned, the light caught his face. "Greg." I saved the clip immediately, labeling it Trespass, HOA President. The next morning I drove straight to the sheriff's substation. Officer Daniels, a tall man with kind eyes and a veteran's patience, listened quietly as I explained. When I showed him the footage, his expression darkened. "Emily," he said, sighing, "you're not the first to complain about that guy." I blinked. You mean? He nodded. He's been warned before. Overstepping, intimidation, private property issues. But he's slick about it. He hides behind his title. I clenched my jaw. Then I'll make sure this time he doesn't hide. He filled out a harassment report, copied my footage, and told me to document every future contact, every knock, every letter, every suspicious vehicle. The more you record, the stronger your case, he said. Don't confront him directly. Let him dig his own hole. Legal nugget. An HOA president can enforce community bylaws, but they can't trespass or harass homeowners. Step beyond property boundaries, and they lose all authority. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by papers, violation notices spread like confetti from a war I never asked for. I started a journal, logging each incident with dates and evidence references. I wanted a paper trail so airtight that even Greg couldn't wriggle out. But part of me still wondered, what was his endgame? Why risk this much just to bully one homeowner? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. There, splashed across the cracked sidewalk in garish orange spray paint, were 6 letters that made my stomach drop. Replace. The paint was still wet, dripping into the crevices. He'd escalated, from harassment to vandalism, and I knew exactly what my next move would be. Greg thought he was tightening the noose, but I was already pulling the evidence that would hang him. The sound hit me first, deep, metallic, gut-rattling thuds that shook the windows. I dropped my coffee mug and bolted for the door, bare feet slapping against the hardwood. Outside, a jackhammer was chewing through the concrete at the edge of my lawn. Dust and shards of stone sprayed into the air, coating my rose bushes in a gray film. "Hey!" I shouted over the noise. "Who authorized this?" The foreman, wearing an orange vest and a look of confusion, turned off the machine. One of the younger workers pointed across the street. "Him," he said simply. "Greg." He stood on the curb with his arms folded, sunglasses glinting in the sun, watching as if he were supervising a road crew he personally owned. "Community maintenance," he called out. "Sidewalk repairs, routine work." I marched toward the men. "This is my property line," I snapped. "You're on my land." The foreman frowned and glanced at his clipboard. "We were told this was HOA-maintained public easement. President Wilson said to start here and bill the homeowner once complete." I grabbed my deed folder from inside the house and came back out with the document shaking in my hands. "You see this? Parcel line ends here," I said, pointing to the printed coordinates. "That strip of sidewalk? County easement, not HOA, not Greg's call." The crew hesitated, looking back and forth between me and the man across the street. Their boots scraped uncertainly against the ground. "Ma'am," one of them said quietly, "we don't want trouble, but we already started cutting." "That's your problem," I said. "Turn those machines off. Now." Greg's voice boomed across the road. "You're obstructing community work. This is violation of Section 7. "Violation of what? My property rights?" I shouted back. "Because that's all you're violating today." Within minutes, Officer Daniel's cruiser pulled up, blue lights flashing against the dust. He stepped out, hand resting on his belt, his expression tight with irritation. "What's going on here?" The foreman spoke first. "HOA president said this was approved. We're just following orders." Daniels turned to me. "You got your documents?" I handed him the deed, still smudged with dust. He studied it, then looked toward the jackhammered hole, near my curb. "Greg," he said firmly, "you're trespassing on private property." Greg's jaw tightened. "That's community land." Daniels pointed at the coordinates. "According to the county survey, it's not. If you continue this work, you could be held personally liable for property damage." For the first time since I'd met him, Greg looked unsure. "This is an HOA matter," he muttered. "Not anymore," Daniels said. "It's a police matter if you don't stop right now." The foreman gestured to his men. The jackhammer went silent, the mechanical roar dying mid-pulse. The air filled with the smell of burnt motor oil and wet concrete. One worker started sweeping debris off my grass, avoiding my eyes. Legal nugget. An HOA can't order physical work on private property without the owner's written consent and proper municipal permits. Any unauthorized construction becomes personal liability for whoever initiated it. Greg took a step forward, his voice low and venomous. You think this ends here? You're making enemies, Emily. I met his glare without blinking. I already have one, I said. He turned on his heel and walked off, his shoes crunching over gravel. The workers packed up, their trucks rumbling away, leaving behind a jagged trench and a silence thick enough to choke on. That night, as the adrenaline faded and exhaustion set in, I walked out to lock my gate. The moonlight glinted off something near my driveway. I bent down. My car's front tire was flat, sliced clean through. The rear one too. 4 neat slashes. No note. No words. Just a warning. Message received. But if Greg thought fear would stop me, he'd just handed me proof I was winning. I called him from my porch, phone to my ear, my voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet evening. You really think those fake invoices won't surface? I said. The silence on the other end was brief, just a heartbeat, but it told me everything. He froze. Then came his carefully controlled voice. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, I replied, my tone calm, deliberate. And so will the county when I'm done. I hung up before he could respond. It had been 2 days since the illegal construction, and I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. If Greg thought he could intimidate me into submission, he'd miscalculated. I'd learned one thing from this fight. Bullies hide behind paperwork, and the only way to beat them is to expose the paper itself. That morning, I filed a formal written request for the HOA's last 2 years of financial records. Meeting minutes, invoices, payments, contracts, everything. Under state law, homeowners have the right to inspect these documents. But when the board secretary read my request aloud at the next meeting, Greg didn't even let her finish. Denied, he barked, slamming his pen against the table. Those records contain sensitive information. I stood up. Sensitive to who, Greg? Or should I say, profitable? The room went still. His jaw tightened. You're harassing this board. You'll receive notice of violation if you continue. I smiled, just slightly. Add it to the collection. That night, Linda came over with her laptop and a bottle of wine. You're not crazy, she said, clicking through old community newsletters she'd archived. Look, these repair announcements. Same vendor name, every time. Wilson Property Solutions. I froze. Wilson, as in Greg Wilson? She nodded slowly. That's his company. I looked it up on the state business registry. He's been billing the HOA under his own LLC. We scrolled through years of transactions, each one a pattern. Sidewalk repairs, landscaping, general maintenance. Always vague descriptions. Always approved by Greg's signature. I could feel the anger rising like heat under my skin. He's been finding homeowners for work that never needed to be done, I said, then paying himself to fix it. Linda leaned back, disgusted. He's been pocketing our money for years. Legal nugget. HOA board members cannot self-contract or personally profit from association funds. Doing so violates conflict of interest laws and can lead to civil or even criminal penalties. We printed everything we could find. Old newsletters, meeting minutes, screenshots of vendor listings. The stack grew thicker by the minute. It wasn't enough for proof yet, but it was enough to rattle him. So I decided to give him a preview. That's when I made the call from my porch. His hesitation told me I'd hit the nerve I was looking for. Later that night, as I organized the papers into labeled folders, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You don't know me, but I used to be the HOA treasurer. I saw what Greg did. I have records he never turned over. If you want proof, meet me tonight. Bring a flash drive. I stared at the message, reading it over and over. The contact name was hidden, and there was no return call option. Just that single line and a time. 9:30 p.m. For the first time, I felt something different from fear. It was anticipation. The kind you feel when the story you've been living in the dark finally starts to come into focus. Cliffhanger. I grabbed my car keys, stuffed the flash drive into my pocket, and whispered to myself, "All right, Greg, let's see how deep this hole really goes." The treasurer's voice trembled as she spoke. "He's been using fake receipts for years," she whispered, glancing around the empty diner like someone afraid of being overheard. "You're not his first victim." It was nearly 10 at night. The diner was half lit, humming with the low buzz of neon signs and the soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I sat across from her in a corner booth, my pulse pounding against the edge of the table. She introduced herself only as Martha, the HOA's former treasurer. Her hands shook slightly as she slid a small black flash drive across the table. "He made me sign off on invoices that never matched the bank withdrawals," she said, eyes darting toward the window. "Every time I questioned him, he'd call it an accounting adjustment. I quit when I realized what was happening." I stared at the flash drive, feeling its weight even before I picked it up. "What's on this?" "Copies of financial records, scanned checks, and emails between Greg and the vendors. Except most of those vendors don't exist." She looked up at me, her expression hardening. "He's been fining residents for fake repairs and paying himself through his company. It's all there." I nodded slowly. "You kept all this?" She gave a small, bitter smile. "I wasn't brave enough to confront him. But you are. Don't waste it." When I got home, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, my heart hammering as the folders opened. There they were, dozens of PDF files labeled by month and year. Maintenance reports, sidewalk projects, community upkeep. I opened the first one. The invoices were filled with vague work descriptions, concrete leveling, erosion control, tree root remediation. Every single one bore the same company name, Wilson Property Solutions LLC. And at the bottom, in neat blue cursive, was Greg Wilson's signature. He hadn't even tried to hide it. Each file revealed more: identical service charges, duplicate invoices, and inflated costs. One homeowner had been fined for unauthorized driveway modifications, only to find Greg had billed the HOA for driveway repairs 2 weeks later, on the same property. It wasn't just me. He'd been robbing everyone. I spent the rest of the night organizing everything into a binder, dividers by category, labeled tabs, and a cover page titled HOA Fraud Evidence, Gregory Wilson. Every document I printed added to the weight of what I was holding, not just on paper, but on my conscience. Linda came over the next morning, coffee in hand, still in her robe. "You didn't sleep, did you?" I shook my head. "He's been stealing from all of us, Linda. Fines, repairs, fees, all of it feeding back into his own company." Her eyes widened as she flipped through the binder. "You could go to the media with this." I looked at her and nodded. "I plan to." I called the local newspaper, the Fairview Chronicle, and asked for the investigative desk. Within an hour, I was speaking to Rachel Moore, a senior reporter known for exposing local corruption cases. I told her everything, from the fines to the forged invoices. She didn't interrupt once. When I mentioned Greg's name, there was a pause on the other end. "I've heard that name before," she said. "Send me what you've got. Carefully. No HOA president wants this kind of light." Legal nugget. Homeowners have the legal right to inspect HOA financials upon written request. Denial or concealment of records is not just unethical. It's grounds for legal action and board removal. By the end of that call, I had a drop-off meeting scheduled for the next morning. Rachel's final words lingered in my mind long after I hung up. "Emily," she said quietly, "I'll run your story. But be careful. Greg's got friends in places you wouldn't expect." I glanced at the binder on my desk, its pages thick with evidence, and realized the war had just gone public. My phone exploded with messages before I even had time to pour my morning coffee. Dozens of missed calls, unread texts, and one headline that stopped me cold: HOA president accused of fraud and abuse of power. It was everywhere: the Fairview Chronicle, the local Facebook groups, even the county news site. Rachel Moore hadn't held back. The article laid it all out: the fake invoices, the falsified repairs, the self-issued payments. Every document, every signature, every connection between Greg's LLC and the HOA funds was right there in black and white. My photos of the cracked sidewalk were now featured beside his mug-like portrait from the community website. Within hours, the neighborhood was buzzing. Homeowners who had avoided me for weeks were now knocking on my door. "Emily, we had no idea," one said. Another whispered, "He fined us last year for that same concrete issue." Now it all makes sense. By that afternoon, someone had taped a printed copy of the article to the HOA notice board, right beneath Greg's framed President's welcome message. Red marker circled his name over and over until it looked like a target. The next evening, the community gathered at the clubhouse for an emergency meeting. The room was packed wall to wall. 50 people, maybe more. The tension was thick enough to taste. I stood near the back, watching Greg at the head of the table, his face pale and tight with fury. "This article," he began, waving a crumpled copy, "is libel, slander, lies spread by a vindictive homeowner with a personal grudge." The crowd erupted in murmurs, disbelief rippling through the air. Linda raised her hand. "So, are those your invoices or not?" Greg hesitated for half a second too long. "That information is confidential." That was it. The room turned against him in a heartbeat. People shouted questions about fines, about missing funds, about why their HOA fees had quietly increased last year. Someone yelled, "Call for a vote." But before any decision could be made, Greg stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. The next morning, I found a letter wedged under my doormat. Notice of lien intent, my name printed in bold at the top. It claimed I owed unpaid community fees, totaling over $3,000, a complete fabrication. It was retaliation, plain and simple. I called Officer Daniels, who sighed when he heard my voice. "He's trying to intimidate you," he said. "Don't bite." Then I called Rachel, the reporter. She connected me with a local attorney specializing in HOA law. By noon, we'd filed an emergency injunction to block any HOA collection or lien action pending investigation. The court accepted it immediately, freezing all HOA enforcement authority under Greg's presidency. When I visited the county clerk that afternoon to file the injunction, Mr. Hughes was waiting behind the counter with a small smile. "Saw the article," he said. "You did good." Then, sliding a folder toward me, he added, "Just for your records, official confirmation from the county. That sidewalk still belongs to your parcel, not the HOA." I took it, feeling a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. Legal nugget. If you receive an HOA lien or fine you believe is false, file an injunction through the county clerk's office. HOA power ends where verified property boundaries begin. That evening, the community's group chat was chaos. Half the residents calling for Greg's removal, the other half demanding an audit. I sat on my porch, scrolling, until a new message popped up in the thread, a video from someone at the meeting. Greg stood in the parking lot, surrounded by a few loyalists, shouting loud enough for the phone mic to catch every word. "She'll regret crossing me. I don't lose, not to her." I locked my phone screen, staring into the quiet night. For the first time, I realized Greg wasn't just cornered. He was dangerous. I pointed at the curb while Greg stood across the street, his sunglasses doing little to hide the sweat rolling down his temples. "Go ahead, officer," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline burning in my chest. "Measure it. Let's see who really owns this sidewalk." The morning sun was merciless, glaring down on the small crowd that had gathered. A county truck idled nearby, its yellow lights flashing, as two inspectors unloaded their surveying equipment. Tripods clicked open, laser levels blinked red, and thin metal stakes marked the boundary between truth and fiction. Greg hovered behind them, trying to look composed, but his confidence was slipping with every turn of the measuring wheel. Officer Daniels arrived soon after, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "All right, folks," he said evenly. "Let's keep this civil. The county's here to verify the property lines. Once we've got that, we'll settle who overstepped." I handed the inspector my certified deed copy, still crisp from the county clerk's file. He studied it, then began pacing the distance from my front steps to the curb, cross-checking coordinates with the map on his tablet. The sound of his boots crunching over gravel was the loudest thing in the air. After 10 long minutes, he turned back toward Daniels. "Confirmed," he said. "The sidewalk in question lies entirely within Parcel 18, Mrs. Carter's property. HOA authorization doesn't apply here." A murmur ran through the small crowd of neighbors who'd gathered to watch. Greg's face drained of color. "That can't be right," he blurted. "We've maintained that stretch for years." The inspector nodded calmly. "Maintenance doesn't equal ownership, sir. According to the deed, the HOA conducted work on private land without permission." Daniels stepped forward, flipping open his notepad. "Mr. Wilson, did you authorize that construction crew last week?" Greg's lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, he muttered, "As part of routine community upkeep." Daniel's tone sharpened. "On private property? Without a permit?" Greg didn't answer. He didn't need to. Daniels had already seen enough. "All right," the officer said, jotting something down. "I'm filing a report for property damage and trespassing under unauthorized direction. You'll be contacted once it's reviewed by the county attorney." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg's control, his arrogance, all of it seemed to melt away in the heat. The inspectors packed up their gear, leaving behind fresh boundary markers that drew a bright, visible line right through his illusion of power. By the next day, word spread faster than wildfire. The HOA's insurance company officially suspended coverage pending investigation, freezing all projects and reimbursements. Without coverage, Greg's so-called authority meant nothing. He was exposed, both legally and financially. Legal nugget. Unauthorized construction or alterations on privately owned property can make HOA officials personally liable for damages. No board position, title, or vote can shield them from civil lawsuits when they cross legal property lines. But Greg wasn't finished. That afternoon, an envelope slid under my door. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single-page letter from a local law firm. Cease and desist defamation. It accused me of spreading false and harmful claims against Greg Wilson and demanded I retract all public statements. I couldn't help but laugh. It was desperate. His last attempt to flip the narrative. I forwarded the letter straight to my attorney, attaching Daniel's incident report and the survey results for good measure. An hour later, my phone rang. It was my lawyer, his voice calm but resolute. "Emily," he said, "I think it's time we stop playing defense." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the pile of evidence stacked on my kitchen table. The photos, the invoices, the maps. Everything I needed was already there. "Good," I said, "because I'm done letting him control the story." My attorney's tone hardened. "Then let's take him to court." Greg tried to smirk in court, but his hands shook when my lawyer held up the county map. The same map I'd pulled from that dusty recorder's office weeks ago. The same lines he'd ignored, the same evidence he'd called irrelevant. Now, under the cold fluorescent lights of the courtroom, those lines were about to bury him. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at him. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her tone clipped, "you authorized work on the plaintiff's property without consent, issued fines without jurisdiction, and allegedly used HOA funds for personal gain. Is that correct?" Greg's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client acted within his authority as HOA president. The plaintiff—" "Enough," the judge interrupted. "Authority doesn't override ownership. Property boundaries are not subject to interpretation." I felt a strange calm wash over me. Months of stress, of letters, vandalism, and whispered threats. It had all led to this. My lawyer, Mr. Preston, stepped forward, voice steady and precise. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendant's behavior extends far beyond overreach. We are countersuing for harassment, defamation, and property damage." He paused, gesturing toward the evidence table. "Here are the surveillance recordings of the defendant trespassing." Here are the invoices showing fraudulent payments from the HOA account to his own company. And here, he tapped the county seal stamped on the map, is the proof that the sidewalk he fined my client for is not, and never was, within HOA authority. The judge leaned forward, studying the document. This is certified? Yes, Your Honor, Preston replied. Filed by the county clerk and verified by the inspector who conducted the survey. Greg shifted in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead. Those invoices were standard maintenance, he blurted. You don't understand how the board operates. The judge raised an eyebrow. Then enlighten me, Mr. Wilson. Explain why you were paying your own company for community repairs. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. Just silence. Across the courtroom, I could hear quiet murmurs, neighbors who'd come to watch. Some had testified about their own fines, others just came to see justice unfold. One of them whispered, "That's him, the one who fined us for the fence." Another added, "She's finally taking him down." Preston clicked through a slideshow of photos. Greg standing beside the jackhammer crew, the vandalized sidewalk, the tire slashes. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than either of us ever could. After a long silence, the judge spoke. This court finds that the fines issued to Ms. Carter were unauthorized and invalid. Furthermore, the defendant acted beyond the scope of his position as HOA president, committing harassment and trespass. She looked directly at Greg. You will reimburse all damages, cover the plaintiff's legal fees, and you are hereby barred from acting on behalf of the Homeowners Association pending review. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Greg's jaw tightened, his face a mix of disbelief and rage. As the gavel came down, the sound cracked through the room like thunder. Some of the neighbors clapped quietly, almost hesitant, as if afraid the sound might provoke him. Greg spun around, muttering to his lawyer, then glared at me on his way out. "This isn't over, Emily," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The verdict had already spoken louder than either of us could. As I stepped outside, the autumn air hit me, crisp, cold, liberating. The courthouse doors closed behind me, sealing off the months of chaos that had consumed my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Justice was done, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's shadow was still following me. When the audit results dropped, Greg's empire collapsed overnight, and everyone finally saw who he really was. It started with an email. Subject line: HOA audit findings, urgent. I opened it, half expecting another fight, but what I saw made me sink into my chair. The audit had exposed over $40,000 in misused funds, all tied to Greg's personal business account. Payments for sidewalk repairs, community landscaping, and maintenance contracts had one thing in common: Wilson Property Solutions, LLC. Within an hour, the entire neighborhood knew. Screenshots of the reports spread across the community chat like wildfire. People who'd once stayed silent were now furious. The same neighbors who'd whispered their doubts at the meetings were posting messages like, "We trusted him, and he made us pay for his lies." The HOA board called an emergency town hall that evening. I almost didn't go. Part of me was tired of reliving the fight, but Linda insisted. "You started this, Emily," she said. "You deserve to see how it ends." The community center was packed. Every seat filled, the air thick with tension and anticipation. Greg wasn't at the head table anymore. In his place sat Mark Thompson, the vice president, his face drawn and pale. "I'll get straight to the point," he began, voice trembling. "The forensic audit confirms that over the past 4 years, HOA funds were diverted to accounts under Greg Wilson's control. The board has unanimously voted to remove him from office effective immediately." For a moment, the room was silent. Then came the sound of applause. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but a steady, unified rhythm of relief. I watched quietly from the back as people hugged each other, some wiping away tears. For months, we'd lived under the weight of one man's ego. Now that weight was gone. Greg, of course, didn't go quietly. Later that night, he sent a community-wide email ranting about false accusations and smear campaigns. But his words held no power anymore. The evidence had stripped him of it. A week later, Officer Daniels knocked on my door again, this time without the tension that used to follow his visits. He held a thin folder in his hand. "Just wanted to let you know," he said. "The county prosecutor's office is reviewing Greg's case. They're preparing charges for fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. It might take time, but justice is moving." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It's strange," I said. "I wanted him to stop. I never thought it would end like this." Daniels gave a small smile. "People like him build walls out of lies. Sooner or later, the truth knocks them down." Legal nugget. When HOA boards misuse funds or abuse authority, members have the right to recall the board through a formal petition. If the misconduct involves financial fraud, local authorities or district attorneys can prosecute under state law. 2 weeks later, a new board was elected. The first order of business: full transparency. They opened the books, published monthly budgets online, and set up a hotline for resident complaints. Mark, now acting president, called another town hall. This time, not to justify rules, but to rebuild trust. When I walked in, people clapped. I wasn't expecting it. I froze mid-step, not knowing how to react. Linda nudged me. "That's for you, Emily," she whispered. "You made them see." At the podium, Mark addressed the crowd. "We owe Ms. Carter a thank you," he said, gesturing toward me. "She reminded us that no one, not even a president, is above the rules. Because of her persistence, our community has a second chance." Neighbors I'd barely spoken to came up afterward, shaking my hand, thanking me. "You saved our homes," one man said. Another added, "We should have stood with you sooner." For the first time in months, I didn't feel like the enemy. I felt seen. That night, I stood on my porch, watching the sunset wash the cracked sidewalk, my sidewalk, in gold light. The air was calm, the street quiet. For the first time, peace didn't feel temporary. Then, just as I turned to go inside, something caught my eye. An envelope sat on the top step, plain white, no return address. My chest tightened as I picked it up. The handwriting was familiar, slanted and sharp. It wasn't another fine, but from the first 2 words on the front, I knew it was from Greg. I opened the letter expecting another fight, another fine, another threat, another excuse to drag me back into the mess Greg had made. But instead it said 3 simple words that stopped me cold. "We're sorry, Emily." For a second, I just stared at the page. The words looked out of place. Too kind, too soft for everything I'd endured. The letterhead bore the HOA seal, but the signature at the bottom wasn't Greg's. It was Mark Thompson's, the new president. I sank into my porch chair as I read every line slowly, afraid that if I blinked, it would vanish. The letter was formal, but the tone was human. It acknowledged the misconduct of prior leadership, confirmed that all of my fines and penalties had been voided, and most shocking of all, enclosed a check refunding every cent Greg's administration had taken from me. The final line read, "On behalf of the homeowners of Maple Glen, we apologize for what you endured. Thank you for standing up for what was right." For the first time in nearly a year, I felt the tension in my chest loosen. The weight I'd been carrying, the fear, the anger, the sleepless nights, lifted like fog clearing after a storm. A few days later, the new board members came by in person. Mark, Linda, and 2 others stood at the edge of my driveway, smiling awkwardly, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "It's not much," Mark said, "but we thought you might want to replant what Greg's crew destroyed." I laughed softly, genuinely. "You have no idea how ready I am to do that." That weekend, I knelt beside the once disputed sidewalk, pulling weeds and brushing away leftover dust from the jackhammer scars. The air smelled like spring again, damp soil, fresh grass, hope. I rebuilt my little flower bed exactly how I'd planned it months before all this chaos started. Bright marigolds, purple lavender, and white roses lined the edge of my walkway. As I pressed the last plant into the earth, I realized that every bloom now stood on ground I'd fought for. Neighbors walked by, waving, smiling, stopping to chat. The same people who once avoided eye contact now thanked me for what I did. "You saved us," one woman said, holding her toddler's hand. "You made this place honest again." I didn't feel like a hero, just a homeowner who refused to be bullied. But I did feel proud, because that single $1,000 fine, that petty, arrogant punishment Greg thought would silence me, had done the exact opposite. It had uncovered a web of greed and control that stretched far beyond one cracked sidewalk. Reflection. Sometimes it only takes one person to say no loud enough for the truth to echo. One fine had exposed an entire network of abuse, and one woman's persistence had reminded a whole neighborhood that authority doesn't mean power, not without accountability. Final nugget. Know your property lines. Document everything. Never let anyone, not a title, not a uniform, not a signature, intimidate you into silence. As I watered the flowers that evening, the setting sun painted the sidewalk gold, smooth, clean, and untouched. Mine, legally, permanently, and peacefully. I turned to the camera propped on the porch railing, hit record, and said, "Ever fought a corrupt HOA president? Tell me what you'd have done." Then I smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and let the camera linger on the sidewalk one last time. The shot held steady on the stretch of concrete that had started it all, calm, perfect, and finally free, as the screen faded slowly to black.